January 17, 1945. The dense jungles of Luzon trembled under distant artillery fire. Heat hung heavy over the muddy trails, clinging to the uniforms of Japanese infantry crouched in hastily dug foxholes. Birds were silent. Even the cicadas seemed to pause as the first rumble of engines approached. Through the haze, dark shapes emerged. Steel beasts rolling over shattered terrain, their tracks crushing roots and debris without hesitation. The M4 Sherman tanks, glinting under a pale morning sun, advanced in tight formation. From the cover of the tree line, Japanese soldiers squinted, gripping rifles as if they could somehow stop the metallic onslaught. The first shells hit nearby bunkers. Wood splintered, earth erupted. A foxhole collapsed, and men were thrown into the mud. Their trained confidence faltered. Whispers of disbelief rippled through the ranks. This was no ordinary American attack. Every movement precise, every gun blast calculated. For the men watching, the Sherman was a revelation. Its 75mm gun fired with unrelenting authority. It moved through obstacles that would have stalled lighter vehicles. And in that moment, the soldiers realized the immovable force before them would not simply be held back, it would push them from their positions, line by line. The jungle held its breath, waiting for what would come next, the tension thick as gunfire began to echo across the hills. The shock of that first encounter set the stage for a battle that would test tactics, courage, and the very will to fight. By early 1945, the Pacific War had entered its most brutal phase. The United States, fueled by an industrial engine unmatched in history, was systematically closing in on Japanese-held territories across the Philippines and beyond. Every island, every foothold represented not just a strategic position, but a test of endurance, logistics, and military ingenuity. Japanese forces, hardened by years of battle, relied on fortified positions, dense jungle cover, and a rigid defensive strategy. Their soldiers were disciplined and fiercely loyal. But supply shortages, exhaustion, and a growing awareness of American technological superiority weighed heavily on morale. From Luzon to Mindoro, the Japanese had fortified hills, rivers, and ridges, creating a network of defensive points designed to slow, confuse, and inflict maximum casualties on advancing U.S. forces. Meanwhile, the Americans brought more than sheer numbers. Industrial output had produced a staggering array of weapons, bombers capable of leveling entire towns, artillery that could strike from miles away, and armored vehicles engineered for mobility and firepower. Among these, the M4 Sherman tank had become a cornerstone of armored operations in the Pacific. Reliable, fast, and well-armed, it allowed U.S. forces to maneuver through terrain that had previously been considered impassable. The synergy between infantry, armor, and artillery gave American commanders unprecedented tactical flexibility. By mid-January, intelligence reports noted that Japanese units were increasingly unnerved by the appearance of these tanks. Encounters with Shermans in smaller skirmishes had already sown seeds of fear as soldiers witnessed their weapons reduce bunkers, pillboxes, and even entire defensive lines with startling efficiency. The stage was set for a confrontation that would not only test tactics, but reveal the psychological edge American technological superiority had begun to impose on the Japanese army. The rumble of engines grew louder, signaling the approach of what would become a decisive clash, the moment when strategy, innovation, and courage converged under the tropical sun of Luzon. The M4 Sherman tank, the centerpiece of American armored power, had been designed with versatility in mind. Unlike heavier European models, it combined speed, reliability, and sufficient firepower to dominate infantry defenses. By 1944, thousands had been deployed across the Pacific, supported by a logistical network that ensured fuel, ammunition, and spare parts were delivered to the front lines with remarkable efficiency. Japanese soldiers, trained to repel infantry and artillery assaults, had little experience with such mechanized precision. In previous battles, they had relied on cunning, ambushes, and the natural terrain to hold positions. But the Shermans moved where the terrain had been considered a natural barrier. Hills, dense undergrowth, and even makeshift barricades offered little resistance to tanks coordinated with infantry squads and supporting artillery. Each Sherman carried a 75mm main gun capable of destroying bunkers, pillboxes, and enemy fortifications, while its .50 caliber machine guns provided suppressive fire against troops exposed in the open. The introduction of these tanks forced Japanese commanders to rethink their defensive doctrines. Small units could no longer hold ground against combined arms assaults. Reports from Luzon indicated that when Shermans appeared on the horizon, entire platoons would hesitate, some retreating to secondary positions before they were even engaged. It was not only a clash of firepower, but a psychological confrontation. Soldiers who had survived years of battle now confronted a weapon that seemed unstoppable, relentless, and indifferent to their efforts. The Americans had also mastered coordination. Infantry moved alongside the tanks, clearing obstacles and neutralizing anti-tank threats, while artillery softened entrenched positions. Communications, supply chains, and reconnaissance were synchronized to a degree that the Japanese found difficult to match. As the Sherman columns advanced toward Japanese defensive lines in Luzon, the confrontation became inevitable. The confrontation of preparation, innovation, and raw battlefield force under the tropical sun of Luzon. For the Japanese soldiers stationed on Luzon, the sudden appearance of Sherman tanks was nothing short of a revelation. Years of rigorous training had taught them to hold ground, to fight with discipline and courage. Yet as the first tanks rumbled over the ridges, their rifles and mortars seemed almost insignificant. The men's eyes widened in disbelief. Conversation slowed to whispers. Gestures betrayed tension and hesitation. The sheer size and relentless motion of the armored vehicles created a psychological shock that spread through the defensive lines faster than any bullet. American commanders had meticulously planned the integration of Shermans with infantry and artillery units. Tanks led assaults across open terrain, suppressing enemy positions, while infantry followed closely to secure flanks and neutralize any surviving pockets of resistance. Artillery barrages preceded advances, softening bunkers and cutting down obstacles. This coordination allowed the U.S. forces to maintain momentum, minimizing the risk of ambushes and maximizing the effect of every Sherman shell. Japanese defenders, accustomed to fighting piecemeal against infantry or artillery alone, found themselves unable to adapt to this synchronized approach. The Sherman was more than a tank. It was a culmination of American engineering and logistical planning. With a 75mm main gun capable of destroying reinforced bunkers, a reliable gasoline engine, and armor designed to withstand most infantry anti-tank weapons, it excelled in mobility and firepower. Its relatively light weight allowed it to traverse terrain that heavier tanks could not, giving U.S. units the ability to strike at points the Japanese considered secure. Survivors would later describe the tanks as almost alive, indifferent to obstacles and capable of relentless pursuit. The Americans had also mastered coordination. Infantry moved alongside the tanks, clearing obstacles and neutralizing anti-tank threats, while artillery softened entrenched positions. Communications, supply chains, and reconnaissance were synchronized to a degree that the Japanese found difficult to match. As the Sherman columns advanced toward Japanese defensive lines in Luzon, the confrontation became inevitable. The confrontation of preparation, innovation, and raw battlefield force under the tropical sun of Luzon. As M4 Sherman swept across Luzon, citizens found themselves caught in the midst of the battle. Villages let loose a shout of "tanks over the hill," sometimes cheers, and other times of January 18, 1945. At first light, the M4 Sherman columns advanced toward the Japanese defensive ridges on Luzon. The rumble of engines echoed through the jungle valleys, mingling with the distant cracks of artillery fire. From concealed foxholes, Japanese soldiers observed, hearts pounding, as the armored formations moved with relentless precision. The first shots were fired from the Sherman's 75mm gun. A pillbox exploded, timber and earth scattering into the morning mist. Infantry squads followed immediately, clearing trenches and suppressing remaining defenders. Japanese troops attempted counterattacks with rifles and light anti-tank weapons, but each effort was met with devastating accuracy. The tanks pivoted, rotated, and pressed forward, their coordinated advance leaving little room for resistance. Smoke, dust, and the cries of the wounded created a chaotic scene, yet American units remained synchronized. Tank crews shouted through intercoms, commanders relayed orders, and infantry moved in step with the steel behemoths. Every bunker destroyed, every defensive position overrun, reinforced the psychological shock that had begun the previous day. By mid-morning, several Japanese strongpoints had fallen. Soldiers who had once believed in the impregnability of their fortifications now scrambled for cover, retreating into secondary lines. The pace of the American advance left no opportunity for regrouping. Commanders on both sides realized that the battle was shifting irreversibly. The balance of force, firepower, and coordination was decisively favoring the Americans. The Japanese lines, strained and fragmented, braced for the next phase of the assault, unaware that the Sherman's advance would soon break their defenses entirely. By early afternoon, the Sherman tanks had reached the core of the Japanese defensive network. The dense jungle offered little concealment. Each bunker, trench, and barricade was systematically targeted. Explosions tore through the hillside as the 75mm shells penetrated concrete and reinforced timber. The air was thick with smoke, dust, and the acrid scent of cordite, masking the sounds of retreating troops. Japanese soldiers attempted mount counteroffensives, deploying reserves and maneuvering artillery, but coordination faltered under the relentless pace of the American assault. Each movement was anticipated, each position neutralized with mechanical precision. The psychological edge held as firmly as the Sherman's armor. Hesitation among the defenders translated directly into casualties. Around midday, reports reached U.S. commanders that entire Japanese platoons had withdrawn or been neutralized without significant American losses. The Sherman's mobility allowed units to flank previously fortified positions, encircling pockets of resistance before they could reorganize. Communication between tanks and infantry ensured that no defensive gap went unexploited. By late afternoon, the collapse was undeniable. Japanese lines fractured completely, soldiers surrendering, retreating into secondary positions, or abandoning posts entirely. The battlefield, once a network of impenetrable bunkers and trenches, was now dominated by American armored units, their advance unbroken. The decisive moment had arrived. The combination of technological superiority, coordinated leadership, and relentless execution ensured that the Sherman tanks not only overpowered the defenses, but also shattered the morale of the Japanese forces. The road ahead for U.S. units was open. setting the stage for the aftermath of one of the most decisive armored engagements in the Pacific theater. As evening fell on Luzon, the scale of destruction became clear. Bunkers and trenches had been flattened, artillery positions reduced to rubble, and defensive networks rendered useless. Japanese units that had once held the high ground were scattered, their command structures in disarray. Survivors spoke of the Sherman tanks with a mixture of awe and terror. Machines that had moved with unstoppable force and precision, leaving no room for hesitation or counterattack. American infantry moved cautiously through the devastated lines, securing positions and tending to the wounded. Casualty reports indicated that while the Japanese had suffered heavily, U.S. forces had sustained minimal losses, a testament to the effectiveness of combined arms tactics and armored protection. Commanders took note. The integration of Shermans, artillery, and infantry had not only won ground, but preserved manpower in a campaign where attrition often defined victory. The psychological impact on Japanese forces was immediate and profound. Soldiers reported being stunned or unable to respond to the speed and firepower of the tanks. Local commanders struggled to rally retreating units, their morale broken by a combination of technological shock and battlefield chaos. Letters and after-action reports later emphasized the sense of inevitability that had gripped troops, an understanding that the Americans could penetrate any line, crush any position, and sustain momentum without pause. With the battlefield secured, U.S. forces began consolidating their gains, preparing for subsequent advances into Japanese-held territory. The Sherman had not only proven itself as a weapon of war, but also as a decisive instrument in undermining enemy resolve. In the days following the engagement, U.S. reports confirmed the strategic significance of the Sherman's breakthrough. Entire Japanese regiments had been neutralized or forced into disorganized retreat, leaving key positions in Luzon exposed. The destruction of entrenched defenses accelerated the American campaign, allowing forces to capture supply routes, high ground, and communication lines that had been considered secure. American commanders noted that the combination of armor, infantry, and artillery had created a template for subsequent operations across the Pacific. The speed and effectiveness of the Sherman advance reduced the need for prolonged assaults, saving countless American lives while systematically dismantling Japanese defensive networks. Photographs and reconnaissance films captured tanks advancing across hills, rivers, and jungle paths, their tracks leaving permanent impressions on the terrain and on the consciousness of both sides. Japanese after-action reports highlighted the psychological toll of facing such a weapon. Soldiers wrote of machines that could not be stopped or positions that disappeared in moments. The collapse of defensive lines did more than yield territory. It eroded confidence in command structures and the viability of traditional defensive tactics. Commanders, facing the impossibility of countering the Shermans with available resources, shifted strategies towards guerrilla-style resistance and withdrawal to secondary lines, acknowledging the technological and tactical advantage the Americans now held. The encounter on Luzon demonstrated the dual power of the Sherman, a tool of physical destruction and a vector for psychological dominance. By breaking the Japanese lines with speed, precision, and coordination, the Americans secured not only territory, but also the momentum that would define their advance in the Pacific theater. The encounter on Luzon was more than a single battle. It was a demonstration of how innovation, coordination, and sheer industrial capacity could redefine warfare. The M4 Sherman tanks, once considered merely another tool in the American arsenal, had proven their decisive power, not only in firepower and mobility, but in the profound psychological impact they imposed on the enemy. For Japanese soldiers, who had endured years of intense combat, the experience of facing these armored machines was disorienting, awe-inspiring, and terrifying all at once. From a strategic perspective, the Sherman represented the synthesis of preparation and adaptability. Its design balanced armor, speed, and firepower, while its deployment reflected meticulous planning. Infantry units, artillery, and tanks operated as a single, coordinated system, each element amplifying the other's effectiveness. The result was not simply the collapse of a defensive line, but the rapid achievement of objectives that might have taken weeks under conventional assault methods. The human element was striking. The Japanese soldiers' shock and disbelief underscore the intangible advantages of technological and tactical superiority. Conversely, American troops exhibited discipline and precision, their confidence rooted in both training and trust in their equipment. The interaction between human determination and mechanical innovation defined the battlefield in a way that remains instructive for military historians today. Beyond the tactical and technological implications, the battle offered a broader lesson in the evolution of warfare. It illustrated how industrial output, logistical planning, and innovation could alter the trajectory of a campaign. More than tanks and guns, it was the orchestration of resources, information, and morale that created victory. As the sun set over the devastated ridges of Luzon, the jungle was silent but for the echoes of what had occurred. The Sherman tanks had passed, leaving behind flattened fortifications, broken lines, and a transformed understanding of armored warfare. History would remember not just the machinery, but the way human courage, ingenuity, and adaptation had combined to shape the outcome, an enduring testament to the interplay of technology and strategy in the crucible of World War II.